Hello and welcome to COS Indiana Live as we bring you Roundtable. The Roundtable segment is presented here every fourth Monday of the month at 7 p.m. We'll be focusing on education and discussion of the topics and challenges we all face as we use the Constitution to save the Constitution. Join us now as we bring you COS Indiana Roundtable with our MC, John Ackerman.
Welcome to COS Indiana Live Roundtable. I'm your host, John Ackerman. This is broadcast number 264 of COS Indiana Live, and our topic this time is presidential powers. Last month we looked at congressional powers, Article 1 of the Constitution. This month we're looking in Article 2 of the Constitution, presidential powers. So let's bring the rest of the panel on right now. And there's our trustworthy friend Dale Parrish, our COS Indiana Live host. Hi, Dale. Good to see you. And Gary Harbaugh, great member of our Indiana team. Hi, Gary.
Good evening.
And here comes our state communications coordinator, Ken Kashuba. Hi, Ken.
Hi, John.
And our Indiana State Director, Dale Tipton. Greetings, Dale.
Good to see you, John.
Good to see you
I
too.
guess I should have brought Debbie on first, ladies first, and sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay.
Ladies first. Well, we saved the best till last this time. Debbie Stewart, welcome. Good to have you at the table again. Now,
The rose among the
right
thorns.
up here above my head, you see a QR code. Ken, would you explain that to our viewers?
Sure will, John. Glad you found that up there in that corner. A QR code with your smartphone will get you a membership to our COS Indiana Live subscription. And all you need to do is go ahead and snap that QR code, and you can put in your name and email address, and you'll join a very elite group of subscribers who get all kinds of goodies that we put in there every month, such as articles and educational material, along with other ways to communicate with people that would like to find out and keep in touch with COS Indiana Live. So join that tonight.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And that QR code will remain there throughout the whole hour. It may disappear once or twice, but it always comes back. Okay. Well, friends, the Constitution of the United States is very clear, very precise in laying out what the president is empowered to do. It's all spelled out there in Article 2, and so that's where this focus is going to be. And we're going to take the presidential powers in the same order that they're listed in Article 2. The first sentence of Article 2, Section 1 says, "The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America." So let's start right there with executive power. Gary, what does that mean? Can you give us an example of it? And maybe when this power has been misused?
Well, there's a lot to be said about this. The executive power is basically the power to oversee and run the federal government. And the executive power means that the president's administration executes the laws that are passed by Congress. There are 15 executive or cabinet level appointees that the president picks to head those cabinet positions. There are about 50 other appointed positions to things like the head of the CIA that are not cabinet level. And if you want to find something very interesting, just do a search for the Plum Book. The Plum Book actually lists about 9,000 appointed positions in the federal government, and the president gets the opportunity to appoint about 4,000 of these positions. And, you know, I can go into some history about this. I'll save that, but just let your mind digest that a little bit. 4,000 positions the new president will have the opportunity to fill. One of the reasons that some people feel like Trump's first term was not as successful as it could have been is because partly because of Russia. And the other part is that he did not expect to win. Nobody expected him to win. And I understand, I'm not 100% certain about this, but it's my understanding within the first year, he only filled about 400 of those 4,000 positions. And so the other 3,600, or really about 9,000 positions, were held by holdovers from the Obama administration. And so much of Trump's policy did not get implemented because those positions were still being held by people from the prior administration. But the executive power is probably the broadest power that a president has.
Okay, Gary, thank you. Is there an example or two of when executive power has been misused by a president?
Oh gosh, you don't have enough time, but let's just name one: executive orders. The idea initially of executive orders was that if the president wanted to say, well, the working hours for people in my administration shall be 9 to 5, you would make an executive order, and that was that. And now what's happened is that presidents have used executive orders to implement policy decisions that are not part of the law. Not sure if this was actually an executive order, but one of the things that President Biden did was direct the Department of Education to forgive student loans. This was an example of using an executive order to bypass Congress, and this is completely an abuse of power. And thankfully, the court's kind of smacked him down on this a couple times. This is really a ball that's still up in the air as to what's going to finally happen with that, because I think he's still pushing to forgive debts before the election so that he can maybe get a few extra, or Kamala can get a few extra votes.
Mm-hmm. You know, I had a few $1,000s in student debt, and I never did get a letter from the president telling me that my debt was going to be forgiven. Anyway, okay. Well, thanks, Gary. And I know that we're going to come around and hit executive orders. We're going to hit that nail right on the head before the hour is over. So thank you for getting into that. And we're going to move on to the next kind of power, and it's called Commander-in-Chief. Section 2 of Article 2 says, quote, the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into actual service of the United States, close quote. So we're going to go to Debbie now and ask her, what does commander-in-chief mean? And can you give an example of that and maybe name a time or two when this power has been abused?
Yeah, sure. So the president is head of all the military. And so all the armed forces, Space Force, National Guard, he's pretty much in charge. He gives the orders. Now, only Congress can declare war, but once Congress declares war, then the president gets to pick who goes where and when and how long and things like that. So that's a big job, and you really got to be listening to the wise people around you who are maybe generals and people like that that are in the military to know what's really going on. And so that's a big ordeal. So if the president makes some wise decisions around who he deploys and where, it can really help his presidency. But what's happened many times is they've made unwise decisions, and it's ended up going against them when they tried to be reelected. An example is just today, Joe Biden sent a small group of troops over to the Middle East. We have about 40,000 there now. But he said today that he was deploying a few more small groups of our men and women to go over there and to help with some of the things going on. They didn't want to say how many and exactly where, which I think is wise, but that, you know, the president anytime can deploy that kind of any of our armed forces. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A time when it's been abused.
Yeah, so during the Vietnam War was a really good example. We had several presidents during the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was 1955 to 1975. And when Nixon came into office, he wanted to send more troops over there. So they came up with something called the War Powers Act, where basically it sought to restrain Nixon on how many he could send and for how long by requiring the executive branch to consult with the president on these decisions. And the War Powers Act is still in existence today. I don't know how much it's used or to what extent, but that's to keep a president from just going overboard on how many people they're sending and for how long they're keeping them there.
Okay. You know, you mentioned the Vietnam War, and I came of age during that time. And I know that it started with President Eisenhower, sending military advisors. My understanding is we didn't have any combat troops in Vietnam, but we had military advisors. It expanded under JFK, and the history books that I've read have indicated that he saw the futility of that, and he was intending to pull out of Vietnam, but of course he got assassinated, removed from office, and his successor, LBJ, built that thing up, got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, and the thing just went haywire after that. So we just kind of snuck our way into Vietnam, and then ended up, it was a huge debacle and a national embarrassment. Okay, Ken, do you have a comment from the public?
We have a question for Debbie in her Commander-in-Chief category. Let me go ahead and put that up here so we have it.
Good.
The question is, he cannot command this. How do we lose that there?
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we got that fast-fingered Dale there. Let me get it back up here. He cannot command the state militia without an emergency declared. Is that true?
Gosh, I don't know. That's a great question as far as the states go. I know that the National Armed Services, and I thought the National Guard also, but that's a great question. Does anybody else know?
I don't know. Does anyone on the round table have insight on that?
Mm-mm.
Now, is
I
he
think-
referring to a state militia or referring to state National Guard?
Yeah, I've not heard state militia, so I'm not
State
sure.
militia is what he's got posted there.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that militia refers to the National Guard, the Indiana National Guard, the Ohio or Michigan National Guard. And I know from time to time presidents have called out the National Guard to help with certain things, but I don't know if an emergency has to be declared. But the president has the power to declare an emergency.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
he's
David,
iterated
Yeah.
the state National Guard. So yeah.
Okay. Well, David, thank you for that question. And I was going to mention at this point anyway, that if you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube, go ahead and post a comment or a question. Big part of Ken's job is to watch the comment boards and to bring as many relevant comments and questions as he can to the screen before we completely run out of time. So
we'll try and get that answered too. We'll try and get that answered for you, David.
Okay, somebody's going to look it up or something. Who knows? Okay, let's move on to the next power, and it's called pardoning power. Here again, I'm going to read from the Constitution, quote, "He shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment," close quote. And here we go to our COS Indiana Live host, Dale Parrish. What does this one mean, Dale?
Well, John, I want to repeat that one more time, and I have a particular reason for repeating it. The president shall have power to grant reprieves. And I want to underscore that because I'm going to comment on that a little bit more. But grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in the case of impeachment. So what this means is that the president can forgive federal offenses, can reduce penalties, and provide a check on our judicial powers. Of course, this does not pertain to impeachments. Now, there have been numerous examples of presidents pardoning using this power. And I found that the examples even go as far back as George Washington using this particular power of the presidential power. But Abraham Lincoln used it. A number of other presidents have used the pardoning power. Two examples, John, that I found were interesting to me that I wanted to point out. And one was Jimmy Carter in 1977. And John, you'll remember this, granted pardon to Vietnam War draft dodgers. Remember that?
Yeah.
And which, I think felt that it was a very much a significant reconciliation of all the feelings and tensions that were going on around the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
And then another example that I thought was very good was Bill Clinton, when he granted a pardon to Mark Rich. You all remember that name?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mark Rich, who at the time was wanted for tax evasion, among some other things. But those are just a couple pardons that caught my eye. Trump did some too that caused some problems. But those are some examples that I thought were very good. Now, I wanted to touch base a little bit more on this topic of reprieves. And what that means, again, that the president has the power to postpone or reduce the punishment for a crime. And basically, effectively delaying enforcement of a sentence. Generally to show mercy for the consequences of a convention. And the reason that I wanted to touch on the reprieve portion of this power is, if you all have heard, President Biden has claimed that he will not pardon Hunter Biden. But what he has not said is he would not reprieve. So any sentence that Hunter Biden earns, you might want to check the news. He could very well reprieve that sentence. It wouldn't be the same as pardoning, but it would be a reprieve. So that's why that part of that really caught my eye.
So practically speaking, then Hunter would carry a felony conviction the rest of his life, but he would serve no prison time.
Right.
That would be the result of a reprieve.
Yep.
And I've heard another legal term, commuting a sentence, which might mean the same thing. Gary, am I barking up the right tree there? That commuting a sentence means you don't have to serve your prison term?
Yeah, commuting is usually done, as I understand it, after someone has already been imprisoned, and they commute the remainder of the sentence to release them. Whereas a reprieve, this is kind of interesting that what Dale brought up, because, they delayed Hunter Biden's sentencing.
Yeah.
And my thinking is they want to put this after the election, then Joe can give him a reprieve without it actually affecting any of the votes in the coming election. But I'm just a cynic, so probably not going to happen. But
yeah. Well,
I also found, John, that on this reprieve, that a lot of past presidents have taken this action. George Bush did it during his time in office. And Obama did it, especially if you recall, Obama did it with regard to people that were involved in drug-related cases. And part of his effort to reform the criminal justice system. So it has been used many times.
Yeah, and I'm not aware of any presidents who failed to use the pardon power. I think they all use it, and a lot of them, the more controversial ones, they wait until the morning of January 20th when they're leaving office at noon and their successor is taking over, so that there's very little pushback, and that president will never have to face a press corps because he's on his way to his retirement home and so on and so forth.
Well,
Dale,
it's interesting that you made that point, because one of a couple of the misuses of this pardoning, this power, that was considered misuse. Once again, I go to Bill Clinton and this Mark Rich. That pardon, just like you said, John, that he issued that just hours before he officially left office.
Okay, yeah.
So he didn't have.
He didn't have to face press scrutiny.
He didn't have to face the scrutiny on that. That's right. So that was a prime example, I think, of what could be considered as misuse of this particular power.
And on the last day of any president's term, the entire focus of the news cycle is the incoming president, the inauguration, the inaugural address, the inauguration balls that night, and everybody's caught up in all the hoopla of whoever the new president happens to be. Now, we've been talking about some history here, and one of my favorite presidents, and I think he's greatly underrated, was Gerald R. Ford. He took over when Nixon resigned, and perhaps one of the most controversial pardons at the time was when he pardoned Nixon for any offenses he may have committed. No investigations. Well, impeachment. He was about to be impeached, and probably removed from office. But that impeachment thing had taken place against Nixon, but there were no criminal investigations yet. And Gerald Ford saw that with the healing of the nation, it was important to put Watergate and Nixon behind us. And he took a very bold step in pardoning Nixon for any offenses he may have committed against the United States. And it may have cost him the presidency. People were angry about it, but decades later, every historian I know about says it was the right thing to do. It brought healing to the nation, and we moved past the Watergate crisis. So very controversial when it happened.
Yeah.
But a real profile in courage. Now, that's the name of the book that President Kennedy wrote before he was elected president. But I think Gerald Ford is a profile in courage for doing what he honestly believed in his heart was the right thing to do. Not so much for Nixon, but for the country. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on to the next one. And it's called treaty power. And the Constitution says that he, that is the president, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. And we're going to go back to Debbie again and ask her to explain this one. Would you please, Debbie?
Absolutely. So all a treaty is really, it's an agreement with another nation or several nations. And the president has that power to make a treaty as long as he gets 2/3 of the Senate to approve it. So a lot of the treaties, and I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, you'd be surprised how many have been made without the approval of the Senate. But that is supposed to be the constitutional path to making a treaty. So the president usually draws it up, or somebody in his cabinet, and then they'll take it over to the Senate, and the Senate will either approve it with 2/3 vote or not.
Okay.
Some examples of, I just look back into the Trump administration. He actually made a treaty that made more books available in formats to blind people. So that was a great treaty. Of course, the Senate approved that. He made some others. He had 2 treaties that were with the Pacific Island states. He had a couple extradition treaties with Serbia and Kosovo. just kind of normal treaties like that didn't usually have any difficulty with the Senate approving. But now, if we move into the abuse piece, there's something called an executive agreement. And basically, an executive agreement is just like a treaty, but you don't get the consent and approval of the Senate, which is kind of crazy. So if you look at the amount of treaties that we have made that have gotten 2/3 approval by the Senate, it's a little over 900 right now, maybe in the 900s. Okay. But the number of treaties that were never ratified by the Senate is over 5,000. So we have gone around the Senate many, many times, and it just completely bypasses their consent. And so these international treaties are now called executive agreements. And an example that would be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. In 1992, established a free trade bloc with Canada, US, and Mexico, was an executive agreement. It did not get the 2/3 approval of the Senate. Now, I did read that sometimes they get a simple majority, but those are still like other kinds of executive agreements. They're not truly a treaty as brought forth by the Constitution. And then I know a little bit later we'll talk about executive orders. This one I really couldn't find an executive order around this, and I think it's because they're called executive agreements. And so why would they need an executive order when they can bypass the Senate with an executive agreement?
Yeah, and the one in recent years that really comes to my mind is under Obama, the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I think Obama knew that would never get approved by 2/3 of the Senate, so he never submitted it. And so it probably technically was one of those executive agreements. And the strength of it is that the president can abuse his power. And the weakness of it is that the next president can undo it, as Trump did. He pulled out of the JCPOA. And it's kind of iffy right now. Who knows where Iran stands with having enough material to make a nuclear weapon, but they're right on the threshold. And of course,
Well,
Israel vows that it'll never happen. They'll take it out before it happens. And so it could be a very messy situation. Debbie?
yeah, well, I just think this is going to be interesting because these treaties, like we're talking about treaties from the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, and basically they're saying, oh, well, it's not a treaty because they don't want it to have to go through the Senate because they know it won't get 2/3 approval. But the interesting thing about some of these treaties, what makes them different, is they want to change our domestic laws. So that should be illegal because the treaties should line up with the Constitution because they're considered the supreme law of the land also.
Good
And
point.
so if we are to sign on, like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, so many of the policies in that really don't go well with our domestic policies here. It would change the landscape of our nation. So it's going to be interesting to see how we assimilate those when they don't go through the Senate.
Very interesting. Ken, what do you have?
Well, our friend David wants to pick on Debbie a little bit tonight. So I'm going to put up his comments to see if she can answer this one. He says, has the executive agreement ever been to the courts if no Senate approval that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, because they're either approved by the Senate or they're not. But I would say if there was some kind of a lawsuit brought up or somebody sued somebody in the middle of that, maybe. But I don't know. That is something I've never heard of. Good question.
Good questions from David tonight. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, David, thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, it's just about 7:30. We're almost halfway through this. And so we're going to take a little break now and look at a very interesting video made a few years back by the late Senator Tom Coburn, who was a great champion for Convention of States. Let's watch the video together.
2015, I spent my time in 21 different states. I was in Ohio last week, by the way. And America doesn't trust you anymore. That's the truth. Because they don't see the actions coming out of Congress that should be coming out. And that doesn't mean that they're right all the time, but you've lost their confidence. And that's not one party, that's both. Right now, the unfunded liabilities of this country with its debt is $142 trillion. That's $1 million per family, or that's $1 million per taxpayer. Either way you break it down. Nobody knows what a trillion is, but when you're telling a young family with two small kids that, by the way, here's the debt burden that's coming to you over the next 25 years, you better be prepared for it. Because the other point that I would make with you is the standard of living in this country, although increased, the median family income is exactly the same as it was in 1988. And there's reasons for that. And the reason for it is too much government and too intrusive a government. But there's still $400 billion of money that, when you include duplication, waste, and fraud. And most of that, it falls under this committee. So, to have a 4-year plan where we knock $100 billion a year out of the federal government goes a long way towards solving our problems. Because if you look at the CBO projections and the OMB projections, you're going to be back at $1 trillion deficits very soon, right? And you're adding about $6.5 trillion a year in unfunded liabilities. So these are real problems that you all have the capability to address, and I came here to encourage you to do that. I would also tell you that there's another movement afoot in the country, and that is to force you to do it. And that's through Convention of States, and 2 have passed this last week. We're at 10, and it won't be long to where we meet the 34 state requirement, and we will have a Convention of States, and then we will make recommendations to the states, one on a balanced budget amendment using generally accepted accounting principles with very little wiggle room that will force you. It'll give Congress the backbone to do what they need to be doing in the first place. And also limitations in scope on jurisdiction. And you're going to see that coming forward. And that now has 1,700,000 activists following it every day, involved in it. 650,000 actually working at state capitals around this country, and we will see a change in our country as that gets closer. One of the things the American people are asking, quite frankly, is you have an oath. Why do we have to have a constitutional amendment for Congress to do what's best for the country? And they have decided that Congress can't do what's best for the country, so they're going to do it themselves under the Constitution. In other words, the Constitution actually is the powerful tool with which to solve the problem of our country. It's big enough to solve the problem.
You agree Washington is dysfunctional?
Oh, yeah, but it doesn't matter which party's in charge. I spent 10 years up here in the Senate and left early because I don't see a solution in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress to fix what's wrong with our country.
Founders gave us a great solution, Neil. They gave us what's called an Article 5 Convention of the States. The federal government didn't create the states created the federal government.
That's a great video. I think I've seen it before, and what a powerful testimony he gave to that Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee after he left the Senate. And he was a great champion for COS. So wanted to show that to our viewing audience tonight. Let's move on to presidential appointments. The Constitution says, quote, "He shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers at councils, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States," close quote. This time I'm going to turn to Ken. Ask Ken to explain what it means and give us an example or two.
Well, John, I think the most probably the power that stands out the most in that power is obviously the Supreme Court justices. I think that's the one that gets most of the attention anyway, along with other ambassadors and other government officials that are all important among all those that Gary brought out earlier, the thousands of appointments he has to make in order to fulfill his cabinet and basically his presidency. So, I think what we look back to as far as just an example would be certainly most recent times would be Justice Kavanaugh. I think that one stands out mainly because of all the because of the circus basically that surrounded that appointee. And of course, the other important thing that you talk about in there is that it has to be confirmed by the Senate. So I think that's basically probably the best example of the power of appointing there in that article. What I did is I think I went back pretty far to look at some abuses of that. And I went back to 1833, where President Andrew Jackson removed Treasury secretaries for refusing to withdraw funds from the Bank of the United States. He also refused to give the Senate a document related to his veto of the act to recharter the bank. In 1834, after that, the Senate voted to censure Jackson. So basically, tit for tat there. But that was basically one of the first examples I found of that being kind of on the shady side. The other one happened in 1868. And again, another Andrew, President Andrew Jackson, or Johnson, I'm sorry. Andrew Johnson fired Edwin Stanton. He was an appointee of Abraham Lincoln's, serving as Secretary of War. And he replaced him with Lorenzo Thomas in early 1868. Many of the, and this was during a year when the 10-year of Office Act of 1867 was put in, and it was put in to keep the president from being able to do that type of action. But he went ahead and did it, and of course it followed with many articles of impeachment that was brought about him at that time. So basically, that the appoint power there is most evident by the importance of the Supreme Court, and I think that was shown under President Trump. Just recently when he appointed he had it. I think sometimes it's a little bit of a divine intervention as to who of those justices either pass away or step down, but he ended up appointing 3, and it really made a difference. It has made a difference in kind of keeping our conservative outlook a little more balanced in our Supreme Court at this point. So that's pretty much
Thank you, Ken. And for those of us in Convention of States who believe in constitutional originalism, it's very important, and we highly value the fact that that Trump's 3 appointments to the Supreme Court are originalists. They want to know what did the Constitution mean when it was written, and how is that best understood and interpreted today. So thanks, Ken, and stay close to me, Ken, because I'm gonna pick on you again, because we're going to go to the next presidential power, which has to do with filling vacancies. Reading from the Constitution, the president shall have power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate, by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. Close quote. Ken, explain that to us. Okay, what's that mean?
Is comes with a little bit of fog to it. That one, the big argument all around that is what was the recess? Almost a President Clinton, a definition of if. So it all came down to what's the definition of a recess? When does it start? When does it end? What is a recess? So that was really, I think, the biggest cloud about that area. What I pulled up on that, I found kind of interesting, and this is according to a G. Calvin McKenzie. He was a professor at Colby College, and his statement was, the principal current use of recent appointments is for the strategic purposes of circumventing the confirmation process. And an example here that I think I can give that basically shows how one of our beloved President Reagan worked his way around this or through this, because I found out basically, with everybody having a little bit of a different definition of this, how the different presidents and what have you have acted on this. But I'll give you an example of what President Reagan did. And He used recess appointment powers as part of his effort to undermine the Legal Services Corporation, LSCD. It was a government agency that provided legal assistance in civil cases for the poor. And Reagan made no appointments to the board of directors of the LSC for most of his first year in office. And he did that to prevent holdovers who were Jimmy Carter's appointments from 1982 grants of the LSC. So Reagan made 7 recess appointments on the last day of 1981. And over the next few years, Reagan made several regular nominations to the LSC board and then withdrew them before a Senate confirmation decision. At the same time, he continued to fill vacancies with recess appointments. So Reagan appointees were thus able to control the LSC between 1981 and 1984, and even though not a single one was confirmed by the Senate. So kind of an interesting workaround with President Reagan and how he handled that situation. But basically the recess area is one of those kind of a foggy area, and how that's defined.
Yep. And it's kind of tricky, and smart presidents know how to tiptoe around that. And if it was a president that we didn't approve of, we might call that an abuse of power. But if it's a president we do approve of, we say, oh, he was wise. Okay, Debbie, I see your hand.
Oh, I just wanted to add this one in here as a story of abuse to add to Ken's. Theodore Roosevelt, during a Senate recess that lasted a few seconds, issued 193 recess appointments.
Whoa.
In a recess that was like seconds long. So there you go. There might be considered abuse there.
Yeah, might be. Okay. Well, thanks, Ken. We'll move on now to what has become an annual event, the State of the Union. But listen to what the Constitution says. Quote, he shall, from time to time, give to the Congress information of the State of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient, close quote. Dale Tipton, I've left you alone for 42 minutes. It's your turn to shine. Tell us what this one means, okay?
Well, this is kind of interesting. This is not, a lot of the executive power is believed to be discretionary, but as far as the State of the Union, that is absolutely not. It is an obligation of the president. And Justice Joseph Story, back in Commentaries of the Constitution in 1833, observed that because the president has more information of the complex workings of the government, there is great wisdom, therefore, in not merely allowing, but in requiring the president to lay before the Congress all facts and information which may assist in the deliberations of that body. And so it goes on to say that only the president who possesses, and this is something I hadn't really thought about, only the president who possesses unique knowledge of military operations, foreign affairs, and the day-to-day execution of the laws, and is the only national representative of the whole people, that gives him the unique knowledge to present a comprehensive assessment of the overall state of the nation and its relations with the world. And so that's basically what is supposed to happen. And the framers fastened this duty upon the president as a means of transparency and accountability. And Justice Story continued that he is thus justly made responsible not merely for a due administration of the existing systems, but for due diligence and examination into the means of improving them. And so this is all of the stuff that's supposed to be out there. And so I guess what I would just ask each of you, do you recall hearing a State of the Union yourself that addressed any of these things? That's kind of the problem. And so, these were done, in person before Congress until Calvin Coolidge in 1923 started doing it by radio. And then Harry Truman began in 1947 to do television. And then beginning with Lyndon Johnson, they moved it to make sure it was in the evenings so it would have a wide, television audience. But the basic focus and the content of what was provided to the American people and to Congress is far afield from the things that were originally intended, because problems of the country are rarely addressed, and it's become it's more of a political soundbite stage, for the different political parties, whoever's in power, to put their message forth. And so, what began as a wonderful purpose and a meaningful purpose has been kind of contrived into something that was never meant for.
Exactly. Boy, you hit that nail on the head. The other Dale, Parrish.
Yeah, I agree with what Dale just said. I think they've become media events, and the State of the Union show basically is what it's turned into. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't even watch them anymore, quite honestly.
It's been a while since I've watched one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, both Dales. Let's move on to the next one, which has to do with convening the Congress. Again, quoting from Article 2, he may, on extraordinary occasions, convene both houses or either of them, and in case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment, he, the president, may adjourn them to such time as he shall think proper. Now, that's interesting. Close quote. That's interesting. Gary, take this ball and carry it for us.
Yeah, the presidents usually just kind of let Congress run itself, I think, in terms of scheduling. But in terms of extraordinary circumstances, so when Pearl Harbor was bombed and attacked, I don't know if the president actually, but I assume he probably called a special session to ask for a declaration of war. And I don't think presidents have typically said, we're going to adjourn both houses of Congress, because that would be seen as kind of an abusive thing to do. And of course, they could just call themselves back into session. Mostly been hands off, but it's an opportunity for a president in extraordinary circumstances to say, hey, Congress, I want you to do something. This is an urgent situation, so let's get together and get her done.
Yeah, that's a power that I don't think I've seen exercised in my lifetime. And so it's pretty rare, but it is there. And the president has that power. Okay, thanks, Gary. The next one can get pretty sticky. The faithful execution of laws. Quote, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Close quote. I just want to note here that Article 1, which is about the Congress, gives the president the power to sign or to veto a bill that has been passed by both houses of Congress. But Dale Tipton, let me ask you to talk about, what does it mean to see that the laws be faithfully executed?
Well, John, you mentioned sticky, and this thing's got glue all over it. So basically, this is under the Take Care Clause. And it says, and it points out here, I've got an article from Cato that says that the clause does not grant power, but rather imposes a duty. So the president shall take care. That's a duty. This isn't optional, but it is mandatory. And second, note that the duty is personal. Execution of the laws may be delegated, but the duty to take care that laws be faithfully executed is the president's alone. And third, notice that the president is not required to take care that the laws be completely executed. That would be impossible given finite resources. The president does have power to make enforcement choices. However, he must make them faithfully. And finally, it is important to remember the historical context of the clause. English kings had claimed the power to suspend laws unilaterally, but the framers expressly rejected that practice. And here the executive would be obliged to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so if we want to talk about a little abuse of this, we turn over, and if you remember, Congress repeatedly considered a statute called the DREAM Act, which would exempt a broad number of aliens from the Immigration and Naturalization Act. The president favored this act, but Congress repeatedly declined to pass it. So on June 15th, 2012, the president announced that he would simply not enforce the Immigration and Naturalization Act against the precise category of aliens described in the DREAM Act. He announced, in effect, that he would behave as though the DREAM Act had been enacted into law, even though it had not. Once again, the president does not have broad prosecutorial discretion and broad discretion to husband executive resources. But in this case, it is quite clear that the president is not merely trying to conserve resources. After all, his Solicitor General recently went to the Supreme Court to forbid Arizona from helping to enforce the Immigration Naturalization Act. And exempting as many as 1.76 million people from the immigration laws goes far beyond any traditional conception of prosecutorial discretion. More to the point, this exemption has a distinctly legislative character. It is not a decision in a particular case that enforcement is not worth the resources. Rather, it is a blanket policy which exactly mirrors a statute that Congress declined to pass. Here, in effect, the president is faithfully executing the DREAM Act, which is not law at all, rather than the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is supreme law of the land.
Mm-hmm. Great explanation and great example of an abuse and the failure to faithfully execute the law that's happened in our lifetimes.
I think the comment was, I've got a phone and I've got a pen, and that's kind of what I'm going to do to make things happen. And that's kind of, I mean, if you think about it, you know, they tried to pass that law forcefully several different times. Congress would never approve it. And for a president to say, well, you know what, you didn't approve it, but I'm just going to go ahead and carve this little section of law out that I'm going to choose not to enforce, and we'll get it done another way. So.
And if we had another hour, we could talk about how that kind of action by any president opens Pandora's box for successive presidents to do similar kinds of things.
Yeah, but there's so many more of these. This is one that came to mind that everybody I thought I might remember, but this happens over and over and over again, where the Constitution is just willfully ignored.
Yep. Recent example. It's in recent memory. Yep. Well, let me turn to the other Dale, Mr. Parrish, because he's going to talk about unauthorized use of power. Dale, when has the president assumed power that was outside his authorization?
Well, actually, of course, many examples. And Dale Tipton just kind of stole one of my examples, and that was when Obama did the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the DACA movement in 2012, which deferred deportation of a number of immigrants that were here, and again lacked congressional approval. And so Dale mentioned or talked about that to some extent there in his section on laws faithfully executed. But another example that I picked up on, again, there are many, and I will mention that Franklin Roosevelt, of course, during World War II, had many instances where he used his presidential power probably beyond the authorized power. But another one that stood out to me as an example was Harry Truman with the Korean War in 1950, when and I wasn't aware of this, but Truman committed U.S. forces to Korea and without a formal declaration of war. So that raised a lot of questions. Obviously, lacked congressional approval and set a precedent. And that precedent exists even today, where we have entered wars. Vietnam's another example that comes to mind. We have the president has entered us into a war situation without getting a declaration of war. So again, there are many many examples that we could go into. George Bush with the surveillance program in 2001 after 9/11 is another example. There are many more, but we're running close on time here, John. So I'll leave it right there.
There sure are many more. Well, this kind of wraps it up. The President of the United States has broad powers. They're specified in the Constitution. And the problem is when one president steps outside the bounds, it sets the precedent. The president sets a precedent, and future presidents build on that. And we get so far away from what the Constitution intended. We need some reforms. Well, before we close this out, I want to give you our email address. If you have any questions at all about Convention of States, email them to us at that address on your screen. Raise your voice, COS@gmail.com. Raise your voice, COS@gmail.com. And I want to invite you to tune in next Monday, September 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern for our next COS Indiana Live. We're going to have two segments. One, Fearless Features, Title IX, Part 2. We already showed you Part 1. We're going to show Part 2. And then we're going to have a section on meeting the founders. So that's next Monday, a week from now at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And the next roundtable will be on the fourth Monday of October. That's the 28th of October at 7 p.m. Eastern, and we'll figure out what the topic will be. So, to close us out, here's an episode of COS Basics on whether or not Congress will control the Convention of States. John Ackerman for Convention of States, Indiana. Welcome back to COS Basics, where we've been having fun busting some myths. Today's myth is that Congress will control the convention process. The opposition is so creative in its ways of disagreeing with this completely rational process. They say that Congress will control the convention process. What utter nonsense. The myth goes like this. Congress will select the delegates and set the rules for the convention. And we believe this because of the necessary and proper clause in Article 1 of the Constitution and in the power to call the convention in Article 5. Well, that's the myth. The fact is that Congress only has the power to call the convention. That power is limited to setting the time, place, and purpose. The power to call the convention does not extend to anything else, like saying who can go or how voting works. Congress is not authorized by the necessary and proper clause to control any aspect of the convention. How do we know this? Well, we know from common sense, we know from the ratification debates, and we know from case law. And we even have Congress itself rejecting on multiple occasions the notion that it can control this process. First, just using common sense, we know that the founders did not authorize Congress to control the convention. Remember why the convention was put in Article 5 in the first place: to give the people a way of amending their Constitution should Congress fail to act. Never forget that George Mason, during the Constitutional Convention, even observed that no amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive, unless the states had the authority to propose and ratify amendments without need of the Congress. And these people who wrote Article 5 also wrote Article 1. So you would have to assume a fair amount of stupidity on the part of the founders to think that they would grant Congress in Article 1 the power to interfere in a process designed to circumvent Congress in Article 5. Second, from the ratification debates. We know from comments made during the ratification debates that it's the states who control the process from beginning to end, not Congress. Here's a quote from the debates in Pennsylvania. The proposed federal constitution cannot be very dangerous while the legislatures of the different states possess the power of calling a convention, appointing the delegates, and instructing them in the articles they wish altered or abolished. Close quote. Third, from case law. In a case known as Idaho versus Freeman, here's what the court said about Congress's authority in the amendment process. First, it must be recognized that Congress's power to participate in the amendment process stems solely from Article 5. Congress, outside the authority granted by Article 5, has no power to act with regard to an amendment. That is, it does not retain any of its traditional authority vested in it by Article 1. Close quote. And fourth, Congress itself doesn't even think it has this authority. Over the course of our nation's history, Congress has proposed more than 40 bills that would exert some kind of control over the convention process. Every one of those bills failed. So not even Congress believes it has the authority to interfere in the convention process. And so the myth that Congress will control the convention, busted.